Final Fantasy VII Remake has just come out and the reviews are in. It is officially the highest rated single player Final Fantasy game we've had since Final Fantasy X, which came out in 2001. It got 10 out of 10 on GameSpot, and it seems that most people agree that this is one of the best Final Fantasy games we've seen in years. But how did Square Enix manage such a feat? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Final Fantasy has been in the decline for a while now, and Final Fantasy VII marks an era for a new Final Fantasy. It wasn't always like this. It took Square Enix years to get their act together. It starts from a very long time ago, a time when incompetent management and delays were the norm, and most people thought that Final Fantasy would never be great again. So just how did Square Enix pull it off? How did the ship turn around so drastically that now Final Fantasy is back on track to where it was back in the 90s? So I hope you liked the video, and let's see how this ship turned around.
A little bit of excitement. We're proud to announce that Final Fantasy VII Remake is coming first to PlayStation 4.
Square Enix announced Final Fantasy VII Remake back in 2015. During this time period, Final Fantasy had fallen off from its original place as one of the best JRPGs of all time, into a series that seemed to be going downhill. Final Fantasy XIV, the MMORPG that came out in 2010, was so bad that Square Enix decided to pull down the game to work on it. The original Final Fantasy XIII came out in 2009. It came to lukewarm reception, with many fans disappointed about the game's linear design and just how long it took for the game to pick up. Square then decided to make a sequel which no one was really asking for, dubbed Final Fantasy XIII 2. In 2011, it once again received lukewarm reception. In March 2013, Square Enix CEO Yoichi Wada resigned, stating that this was the first step to quote-unquote management reform. Square was not achieving its financial target in 2013. It was expected that they would lose 105 million USD by March fiscal year. In 2013, Square decided to re-release Final Fantasy XIV, this time dubbed Final Fantasy: A Realm Reborn. Surprisingly, it received critical reception, but this was an outlier in the grand scheme of things. Once more, Square Enix decided to announce Final Fantasy XIII Part 3, which was scheduled to release in 2014. Final Fantasy XIII had a difficult time appeasing fans. Lightning was just a character that fans didn't resonate with, so much so that it actually caused a riot in the official Final Fantasy forums when it was announced that Final Fantasy XIII theme would be coming to Final Fantasy: A Realm Reborn. Fans didn't want any of it, basically telling Square, "We don't like Final Fantasy XIII, stop trying to shove it down our throat." It was soon enough that Square finally realised this too, and it was time for a fresh cast of characters. This time, a new entry into the Final Fantasy series called Final Fantasy XV, which was in development hell for the longest time. It was finally scheduled for release in 2016, and after years of anticipation, Final Fantasy XV finally came out, and it was received, once again, to a mediocre reception. It seemed for the longest time that this is the cycle how it went with Final Fantasy. An awesome CG trailer, shown by gameplay, only to be let down after its initial release. Awesome CG trailer, lackluster gameplay, let down fans. Rinse and repeat for over a decade. Fans had been asking for a remake of Final Fantasy VII for the longest time, and to be fair, we did receive some Final Fantasy VII remasters, such as the Steam version, which was actually pretty decent. Square did its job trying to port Final Fantasy VII to as much systems as possible so that people could experience it on the platform of their choosing. But what fans were truly and really asking was, can we get a fully fledged remake of one of their favourite games of all time? People thought Square Enix would never do it. They're just too afraid to touch such a masterpiece. After all, how many games can get a remake and end up getting the same critical praise its original did? Before Resident Evil 2, this was incredibly rare. In fact, I don't recall any game doing it successfully. E3 2015, during Sony's conference, Square announced that they would be remaking Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation 4. But then, in 2016, news hit that Final Fantasy VII Remake would be episodic. It seemed, at the time, once again, this was just the beginning of a cycle, shown by a cinematic trailer, followed by news reports that the game hadn't even begun its development when they showed the trailer, and then the game's director, Tetsuya Nomura, conceded that Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced too early. This continued to mount as Square announced that we couldn't expect to see Kingdom Hearts 3 or Final Fantasy VII until at least 2018. In 2019, we were shown numerous trailers showcasing the game's cutscene. The game looked incredibly faithful to Final Fantasy fans, but only time would tell if Final Fantasy VII would be the latest in a long-running pattern of disappointment. For a lot of people, Final Fantasy VII showed that video games could be more than just competitive. It could tell stories about characters, love, loss, adventure, and happiness. It showed that video games had the power to be taken seriously. Final Fantasy did this through one specific scene that I won't spoil, but if you've played it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. At the time, Final Fantasy and Metal Gear Solid were the best story games, and it showed. It showed that video games could be designed for a more mature audience. and that it could be a writer's choice and form of telling a narrative-driven adventure. Final Fantasy VII showed that people would care about characters. Cloud's iconic Buster Sword is still, to this day, one of the most recognizable weapons in all of video games. People still remember the relationships they had with Aerith, Tifa, and Barret. The adventure that spanned multiple hours left players with reactions that very few mediums can compete with. Personally, I remember the way I felt after playing Final Fantasy VII. It felt like you were saying goodbye to your friends. It felt like you were saying goodbye to such a beautiful adventure that had taken you out throughout another world. It was the first game to enact escapism successfully. Even by today's standards, Final Fantasy's story is still among one of the best, thanks to its evil villain, Sephiroth, being one of the most menacing villains in video game history, and the hatred the characters feel, you'll also feel thanks to its great writing. And this game was made in the 90s, how many games can show that? While there were always great video games on Nintendo systems, and Final Fantasy's roots stem from Nintendo, the reason why Final Fantasy VII is so loved by many is because it was the first game of its type to really hit the mass audience. Yes, there were games like Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, and of course Final Fantasy VI, which were great story-driven games in their own right. But for a lot of people, Final Fantasy VII was one of the best things that happened during their childhood. People always wondered what would it be like if FF7 was reimagined, remade with modern technology and voice acting, cinematic moments and cutscenes. How much more emotional would it be? How much better would it make it? People had been asking Square for years to reimagine this gem, and before E3 2015, there was rumours swirling around, and everyone didn't believe it, that could Final Fantasy really be remade? I mean, would Square Enix really do it this time? Yes it was. Final Fantasy VII Remake was scheduled for release on April 10th, 2020, and with the exception of a few territories being able to snag it early, like mine, from the beginning when Cloud jumps off the train, followed by a shot of Jessie, Briggs and Barret, and just seeing their reactor, it was like something out of a dream. It was incredibly faithful to what the PS1 version reimagined would look like. The characters' voices were so faithful to exactly how we thought it would be like, and they sounded when we played it on the PlayStation 1. Barret with his overcocky attitude, having a bit of issues with Cloud and not trusting him in the beginning, his epic looking gun that's attached to his arm. What really surprised me about the remake was Jessie. In the original Final Fantasy VII, she was pretty much a minor character, but she's been given the star treatment in this remake, clearly flirting with Cloud, and you actually get to see her backstory and what made her join Avalanche. It's moments like this that make Final Fantasy so rich with character development. Final Fantasy VII Remake does this segment beautifully, but this is just the start. Going through Sector 7, an iconic area from Final Fantasy VII, it was almost identical. Meeting Tifa and seeing her at the bar, seeing Barret's daughter Marlene. What made this scene so special was that you could see in the characters' eyes and the emotions they were eliciting. Tifa clearly wants Cloud to stay, and Cloud's flashbacks from when they were younger really helps to add the understanding of the history between these two. Square Enix even created the motorbike scene, which, I'll be honest, wasn't the best part of Final Fantasy VII, but it just goes to show you the attention to detail. To make a whole motorcycle level, I can't imagine it would have been easy. It did look cool though, and of course the highlight of the game, meeting Aerith. Perhaps the most important element of Final Fantasy VII. Creating a lovable, bubbly character would prove to be the backbone of Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game definitely takes its time, allowing some time to develop between these two relationships, slowly finding out why the Turks are interested in her, and that the situation grows to be more important than Cloud initially thought it would be. Making Aerith's personality and characterization would be no easy task. After all, had the game failed to do this, it would be disastrous. But making a playable Aerith that has meaningful abilities, that would be fun to play, that makes it all the more challenging, and once again Square Enix did the unthinkable, and Aerith's abilities were incredibly important to the overall success of your party. The game wasn't afraid to do a little bit of comedy, showing the slums and Cloud's desperate attempt to save Tifa. Square perfectly captured this moment and added way more emotional engagement thanks to its dancing scene. Final Fantasy VII had a blueprint to go off, of course that being the original one that launched on the PlayStation 1. Its characters, its artistic design was all made in the 90s, but what the team had to engineer from the ground up was a new gameplay system. JRPGs have had a tough time reaching a mass audience, and most people want something more faster paced and more active. If there's one element I thought Final Fantasy VII Remake would fail in, it'd be this part right here. The gameplay in the beginning of the game might feel a bit mashy, just doing offensive maneuvers. Of course, the best defense is a good offense, but as the game starts to get more and more difficult, you start having to plan out your attacks, dodging, rolling and using abilities and summons, as well as your items, which all cost ability points. It makes the gameplay a lot more strategic. Some of the enemies are a bit spongy, which is one of my complaints about the game, and the camera can be a bit wonky at times. But overall, what Square Enix have created here, reimagining Final Fantasy game with an active combat system, is really impressive. But for me personally, the moment when Final Fantasy VII Remake really became something special was in Chapter 16, when you actually go inside the Shinra headquarters, and you get to see how Shinra became so powerful and their backstory. And its beautiful cutscenes and character reactions, it's captured the same feeling Final Fantasy VII did on PS1. The same heartfelt moment of being totally immersed in this world. It's a feeling I thought would be impossible to capture again, but there I was, in front of my TV experiencing that same feeling I once did before. Of course, Final Fantasy VII Remake is just part 1 of what inevitably will be a trilogy. I was a bit apprehensive like most people. After all, how many people want to see one of their favourite franchises be split up in parts just to make more money for the company? But Square Enix did what they set out to do. They made Final Fantasy VII Remake dense and populated, and full of content. It takes over 30 hours to beat minimum. That's not even including if you want to do all the side quests and see all the game has to offer. If you're going to run out and get the platinum like I'm trying to get, you're looking at 60 hours plus. It's hard to argue with the value of that. He's hoping that the next entry into the Final Fantasy series won't be long and far off. The new management reform that kicked in 2013 hopefully will continue to produce great Final Fantasy content. Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn is one of the best MMOs you can get into right now, and Final Fantasy VII looks to be a Game of the Year nominee, which who knows how long it's been since a Final Fantasy game has been nominated for a Game of the Year. But for now, let's leave this moment up right now. This is the highest rated Final Fantasy game we've had in years, and he's hoping to many more.